Good morning and Happy New Year. This is Christina Osborne with ISO's Stakeholder Engagement Team, and I'd like to welcome you to the first meeting to kick off Working Group 2 of the Extended Day Ahead Market for EDAM initiative. This working group will focus on the transmission, commitment, and congestion rent allocation topics. Just tell everybody that all of the phones are unmuted, so please make sure you manually mute your phone on your end, and I'll go over instructions for how we're going to manage the meeting later on. So Deb Levine, who is the Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management, will be the facilitator for this working group, and Emily Hughes, Regional Affairs Analyst, will be the scribe, and I'll be providing support for the meeting. This working group meeting will meet weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays through the week of March 14th, 2022. The ISO hosted a meeting on December 16th to review the organization and logistics for these working group meetings. So if you want more information on how these groups are structured, I do encourage you to review the presentation or listen to the meeting recording for that December 16th meeting, which are available on the EDAM Initiative webpage. So after I review the logistics, I'll turn the meeting over to Deb to cover the objectives of this meeting, review the principles specific to this working group, and then she'll ask the group to review and prioritize the initial for the transmission, commitment, and congestion rent topics. And then at the end of the meeting, Emily Hughes will provide a recap of the discussion, and then Deb will go over the topics for upcoming meetings. We also have Phil Pettengill on the line. He's listed as a panelist. Phil is the Director of Regional Integration at the ISO, and he'll be serving the role as coordinator overseeing the progression of all of the working groups. So as far as the meeting participation and logistics details, these are collaborative working groups, and they are intended to foster open dialogue and sharing of ideas and perspectives. So active participation is critical to meet the objectives. The intent is to have constructive and inclusive discussions, so we do ask that you please respect the opinions of others. The phone lines will remain open throughout these meetings to enable open dialogue. However, similar to other stakeholder meetings, please raise your hand if you have a question or comment to help better manage the meeting flow and discussion. We are recording all of the working group meetings, and we'll post the video files on the related web pages for informational and convenience purposes only. And as a reminder, please contact the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. And stakeholders are welcome to present their perspectives at these meetings. So there is a link here on this resources slide where you can, if you have any questions or inquiries about the working groups, please use this link, or if you're interested in presenting at a future meeting, please use this link to let us know, and we'll reach out to you. And if you are planning to present at an upcoming meeting, we ask that you send your presentations in 5 business days in advance so that we can post those for the other working group members to review prior to the meeting. And so there are several resources linked here. We have a link to the common EDAM concepts and principles. Those were presented at previous forums. And then there are individual web pages for the working groups. We've provided the links here. And then if you haven't registered for the working groups, we do encourage you to do so. That helps us gauge participation as well as facilitate communication throughout the process. So with that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to the facilitator, Deb Levine. And Deb, just a reminder to unmute yourself.
I hate that double mute. Thanks, Christina.
Sure.
Before we get started, I see that Cathleen Colbert already has her hand raised. Is it regarding the logistics, Kathleen?
Yes, it is. Thanks, Deb. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just have a quick question. I heard the 5 business day deadline, and my brain went, ooh, I don't know how that will work with all the meetings. Is there any chance that that's still open for some flexibility to something more like 2 business days or 3 business days?
I think it's, go ahead, Deb. Go ahead.
It's all right. Go ahead, Christina.
No, I was just going to say, I think it just depends on the meeting. Like if it's planned well in advance, we're just hoping to get the materials earlier so that we can post them for the other working group members to review.
And typically we post 2 business days in advance, so we would need it at least 3 business days in advance in order to get it posted.
But we can coordinate, you know, we can coordinate with you. I'm sure there'd be some flexibility, Kathleen.
No, and actually that helps make more sense. So the idea is it's not the deadline for posting it on the CAISO's website. There would be a chance to still kind of iterate a little bit between that. It's just getting it out to the groups that's registered. That wasn't clear to me up front, but am I understanding it better now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathleen.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Deb Levine. I've been with the CAISO since before startup. I've been involved in a lot of things and a lot of different jobs at the ISO, including doing the transmission access charge and MRTU. So quite a broad background. Hopefully I can lend some help to this discussion. With regard to today's objective, what we'd like to do is go ahead and just give a quick background of the design principles. They've already been discussed at 2 separate stakeholder meetings. And what I'd really like to focus on is making sure that all of the items that need to be included from the design principles are in the scope list. And as you saw, I've gone ahead and actually already edited the scope list to incorporate in the all of the answers to the questions that were provided to the stakeholders. So there's a red line copy of the scope list so that market can see the whole picture of all of the different items. And for today, all I'd like to do is focus on, have we got the right topics? Not the details and the design, but just have we got the right topics first? And then if we have time today, great. We can go ahead and look at what's in there for the design. But we'll go ahead and that will be what the subsequent meetings are all about, is dealing with the all of the intimate details of the design for the transmission.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Deb, but I would like to announce, ladies and gentlemen, if you are unmuted and you have not remuted yourself, please do so until you are ready to speak, because I hear a little interference in the background. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
And I also see we have a question from Mike Castaneo. Can we hold the CAISO to posting materials 2 days in advance generally? I believe that is what we do. So unless there's some emergency or some last minute change. So moving on, next slide. So the principles for the transmission commitment is to maximize the amount of transmission made available to EDAM. Obviously, in order to optimize and get the most economic prices for all of the different participants in the extended day-ahead market, you're going to need to have transmission in order to transfer resources back and forth to ensure that you've got the lowest cost. For this slide, I don't think reading them to you is going to be helpful, but I would just suggest that we, kind of gloss over them unless somebody has a question regarding what the commitment is. Okay, next slide. So bucket 1, the reason for bucket 1 is to go ahead and coincide whatever transmission, either network or point-to-point, is being used for load service and resource efficiency obligations. So the other group that Mark Richardson is facilitating is going to be determining how the resource efficiency tests are going to be done and they need to correlate the actual transmission associated with the resource efficiency in order to tie the two pieces together to make sure that it is firm and able to serve the load. So that's the primary reason for bucket one. Any questions on bucket one? Kathleen?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I have a higher level question perhaps, and I think I'm just lacking context for the reason for buckets. I think I understand what you said, but in my mind, once you set up the components of any of the transmission, they can feed into any calculation once it's designed. So I just was wondering if you could spend a tiny bit of time on why we're defining buckets instead of defining like point-to-pointness and what those amounts are and having, like, it seems like a decision was made to create buckets rather than designate transmission types, and I'm lacking the context for that. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. So the reason for creating buckets is, as you'll see in the other definitions, it's for what is the usage of the transmission. So in bucket one, the usage of the transmission is for ensuring resource sufficiency. Bucket two is in essence firm transmission that is able to be used in advance. People have long-term contracts for it, et cetera. Bucket three is more transmission that is available on a day-to-day basis, more for the available transfer capability, and might be available one day but not available another day. As far as the firm, conditional firm, point-to-point, the main thing for EDAM is that other than the resource efficiency transmission, is you want transmission that is capable of transferring between the different entities, EIM entities that are going to be a part of EDAM. What goes on within the balancing authority area is already, the transmission is already fixed for that. So the bucket two and the bucket three are predominantly looking at what are the transfer capabilities between, let's say, PAC or Nevada and each other. You know, how much transfer capability do you have between the two of them versus how much transmission is within a given balancing authority area. I saw Cathy Anderson, you were part of the group that came up with the buckets. Do you have a better, I think I saw, would you want to jump in?
Hi, yeah, sure. This is Cathy Anderson from Idaho Power. So the buckets really were just kind of, you know, even an idea conceptually introduced back in 2019 or whatever very first stakeholder workshops on this came from. And it really just, you know, did come from that concept of trying to identify where the transmission is going to come from, who's the right holder, what's the obligation to put it in. And then it's also a way to determine potential additional compensation that might be required, as well as congestion rent allocations and what's eligible. So if we just say, hey, anyone who has transmission, put it in, it doesn't provide the same thing as saying, hey, if you have transmission that you're using for your resource efficiency, that should be given to the market for optimization, provided it's not self-scheduled. And that's a kind of a should or must, as opposed to a bucket two transmission that somebody has already purchased and might decide to put it in the market or not. And then again, that unsold transmission that we're saying, hey, this should be put in the market, but there's a rate to it. So it's really just trying to differentiate how the transmission is coming to the market, who's the owner, and if additional compensation would be needed or how that compensation occurs, as opposed to just a big old jumble of transmission.
Yeah, and Cathy, thanks for that. And if I can ask you a follow-up question. So I totally understand not saying a bundle of transmission down to buckets. What I'm trying to connect in my head is like the way that I think about areas outside of the CAISO is the kind of formulas that like your entity and others presented in the transmission services, and like that we talked about from Vistra when we kind of did that level setting. So I start with, okay, what we're talking about, yeah, if we're going to start a transmission conversation, what are the pieces that go to native load, deficiencies, what's earmarked for that, what's NITS, what's, if there's a secondary network service, what's tied to that, that's all set aside, right? And then we feed down, but those formulas are very tangible to me versus buckets are kind of conceptual. They're so general. I'm trying to get in the weeds, but I wanted to be clear that I'm not saying why aren't we starting with transmission. I'm saying why are we starting with buckets and not OAT language?
Yeah, and you know, it really was just to kind of identify, because for instance, I'll give you an example and maybe that helps. So for Idaho Power, for example, we may use some external transmission for a market purchase to serve our internal load. So there's two different types of transmission that involves, right? That's a point-to-point transmission, preferably firm. And then there's also the network transmission once you get it inside of our borders. And the thought is both of those are bucket one.
Right.
And so that's kind of why we were, you know, so we could say, yeah, point-to-point or network transmission that's utilized for load service. You know, we could say that and kind of define bucket one further. This was just trying to get that bigger picture of kind of any transmission you're using to meet your resource efficiency showing, whether it's point-to-point or network, is kind of in there. So I don't think we gave it that much more thought beyond that.
Okay, no, that makes sense. And I assume that when we get to the scope, that a part of the scope is what components go into the buckets. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, cool. Awesome. No, thank you for this context. I know a lot of great work was done with this smaller group, and so I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding that context. So thank you for your time.
No problem. And yes, you got to remember the principles are just at a high level. When we get to the scope and the design discussions, that's where we'll get into the detail as to, well, firm is used here, point-to-point is used there, those types of things. So I've got Doug Boccignoni has a question.
Yeah, this is Doug Boccignoni from Flynn Resource Consultants for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Just in terms of what was just described about the bucket two is sort of, you know, this independent decision about participating in the EDAM, you know, sort of voluntary versus the bucket one is sort of must be made available to the EDAM. You know, there was a comment made in yesterday's working group meeting. I think it was by Jeff Nelson from SCE. Someone asked the question about, you know, are you in the EDAM or not? And it was with regard to loads and resources. And I think what Jeff said is, you know, once the decision's made by the entity to be in the EDAM, then all the load and all the resources have to participate in the EDAM. And this characterization of the bucket two transmission makes it sound like that concept is different for transmission, that the transmission participation is not, you know, in or out. It's sort of independently made by the customer. Is that you know, am I interpreting that distinction properly? As compared to what Jeff said yesterday about the loads and resources, you know, they don't have a choice. They're participating.
Jeff, would you like to chime in on that?
Hey, Happy New Year, everyone. Jeff Nelson, SC. Hey, Doug. Yeah, I think that's fair. Transmission's a little different. I mean, the transmission that's needed for a balancing area to serve its own load, it's going to have to be in. And that's sort of the bucket one. But if you look at the other stuff, when they've got excess transmission, the idea was we were not trying to prevent them from making long-term sales with transmission that wasn't necessary, or even short-term sales with transmission that wasn't necessary to sort of serve their own balancing authority. and we wanted to recognize that there are existing contracts out there, and some of those existing contracts may have evergreen or renewal rights. So yeah, transmission's a little different. We're not asking transmission owners to unwind all of their contracts and turn over all of their transmission all of the time to EDAM. That's what we did in the ISO. It was a long, lengthy process. For EDAM, we're not asking them to do that. Does that help?
Yeah, that does. I appreciate that clarification. I guess it raises some questions for me, because if the resources and the loads are participating, but the transmission isn't necessarily participating, it seems like there could be a little bit of a disconnect there.
Yeah, but think about that as today, right? People have oat sales today because they have sort of excess transmission. So it's kind of that excess that's sort of in play, where they have existing contracts because they had excess transmission that got sold.
I think I need to think about that a little more. And then just a comment on, there was a point on the bucket one slide about, the transmission would be participating but not compensated. But it seems like in any of these buckets, there's compensation, right? If there's congestion revenues are collected, and depending on how those are allocated, there will be compensation to somebody.
Well, but the compensation is already, you've already acquired the transmission to serve your load. You've already paid the transmission provider for it. So that's why there's no compensation, because you've already paid for it.
Yeah, maybe I should clarify. What I meant is, but there will be congestion revenues collected, and depending on how those get allocated back either to the provider, it's not like somebody's gonna get those revenues, and then if it's the transmission provider, then that's gonna reduce their overall revenue requirement at some point. So there is some form of compensation even for bucket one. Not to the
Right.
Not to the customer, but indirectly they're going to get it. So it seems like in any of these buckets there is some form of compensation.
So Kathy, did you guys talk about that when you were discussing the principles at all for bucket one?
Again, Cathy Anderson, Idaho Power. And yes, if you want to consider the congestion rent allocation as compensation, then that would be a true statement. But what we're talking about bucket one and even bucket two potentially is that there's no incremental hurdle rate compensation like there would be with bucket three, because in either situation, the transmission service provider has received payment for that money or for that usage. And so, but in all cases, yes, transmission should be, allocated its share of congestion revenue should that congestion appear.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for that
just
clarification.
Differentiating between an additional hurdle rate above any kind of congestion as opposed to just congestion that just happens.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could follow up a little bit, Doug, we also have the issue that you've got someone with an existing contract that may be in sort of bucket one or bucket two. And basically, we want to find a way to make sure that they've already paid for the transmission once, that they don't have to pay congestion on top of that. So like you're saying, the congestion rent allocation, where the principles wound up going was that the congestion rent's going to go back to the transmission provider, and then they're going to dish it back off through their OATs. And if you had an existing transmission contract holder, they need to be sort of insulated, sort of like the perfect hedges in today's ISO's world. So yeah, the congestion rent is definitely going to flow, but in a lot of ways, it's probably going to be to make existing contract holders whole, so they're immunized from the congestion. But as was mentioned, bucket three is a weird one because it's like sort of the parallel to the transmission owner selling that through their OAT service. There's going to be some sort of hurdle rate that the market has to clear before the transmission gets used. That's at least the current thinking. And so yeah, so bucket 3 is different than the other transmission. At least that's the current thinking.
Doug, are you okay?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. I appreciate the explanation.
No problem. We also have a question from Dan Williams. You're double. There you go.
Hi, thanks, Deb. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. So just when trying to think about how the buckets fit together and kind of the higher level purpose, I'm still questioning a little bit how the potential EDAM market participant BAs or the CAISO are really thinking about what the Western markets look like after the insertion of EDAM into the mix. And I ask that because I question, who is still continuing to use transmission outside of EDAM? How are entities that are even in EDAM transacting prior to the EDAM taking over to establish the transmission that may be there for bucket 1 or a different bucket, and kind of without that high level concept for how the market is envisioned to look when this goes in, it's just difficult to think about what is appropriate. And when the EIM was inserted, it definitely had an impact on the bilateral market, the hourly bilateral market, but we were able to kind of back up the time frames for the bilateral market for EIM participants and then for the market in general. But I'm not getting how that fits in the day ahead context. And I don't know if that's maybe something Cathy could talk through about how they've thought about it for Idaho and their customers, or if you have any thoughts there.
Sure. Yeah. So Dan, yeah, I this is a big question, right? Is what's it going to do? I think the way I look at it is that I still have got to go procure transmission per, my RA programs or, my own requirements ahead of time in order to show my own sufficiency. So what it's probably going to do is it's probably going to back it up even further, right? So it's not maybe the day ahead, it might be the day before the day ahead. And create that kind of situation. It's really hard to say what it's going to do. And as far as who's still going to, potentially do that, again, it's still going to be those load serving entities that have to meet RA requirements, whose own internal practices maybe require that firm transmission, maybe their RA programs do, and they're going to still have to show that sufficiency in that transmission that goes with it. So it also could be non-EDAM participants, right? I mean, not every BA is going to join EDAM right out of the gate. And so there's going to still be that business. And, because none of us are getting rid of our oats, there's just that still requirement to offer that. 5 years from now, if EDAM gets up and running, it could be a totally different story as to what it looks like. But that's how we've kind of thought about it, is that transmission still has to be procured for our market purchases, for our showings, and all of that.
So I kind of heard two things there. I guess one would be that, so you think there may be a possibility that some of the existing day-ahead trading, like if you're trading at mid-C or something like that, could develop into a 2-day-ahead type of a market in order to narrow down your position from maybe where you were on a further forward basis when you figure out your load forecast and variable energy forecast, those sorts of things. But there'd be some sort of transacting happening there prior to the EDAM that would then establish maybe your transmission position that you're bringing into the EDAM. But then also you expect there may be some third parties within your BA that may need to schedule transmission after the day ahead or after the EDAM run to match up, I don't know, third party delivery of resources to load from outside. I guess that's the piece that I'm wondering. Yeah. We're going through this exercise of talking about residual transmission still offered in the OAT, but I don't know who's using that.
So for bucket 2 or bucket 3, so for bucket 2, it could be just existing OAT customers who have purchased wheeling rights across us who have not elected to use them. And your second part, it's not necessarily going to be an LSE in our area unless they want to self-schedule something, right? Then they've got to go get the transmission to accommodate that. If for some reason they have this self-scheduling need. But it could be somebody that's trying to wheel across an EDAM BA to two non-EDAM BAs. They still have to have that ability to move that, and so they could be using that transmission and procuring that transmission as well. Because I just don't envision however many EIM entities joining EDAM on day one. I just don't think, this is just me speaking, Cathy Anderson, not necessarily Idaho Power, but just knowing how far each of the entities are already in, market evolution, some are going to just take longer and aren't going to be ready on day one. So you're still going to have this, I suspect, this piecemealing of entities joining. So you're still going to have that outside of EDAM footprint transfers.
Thanks. I guess just to wrap it up for time's sake, I guess it would be very useful as a stakeholder for either the CAISO or maybe in combination with some of the EDAM BAs to just sketch out a high-level vision for what they believe the Western markets may look like under maybe a high, medium, and low adoption of EDAM, so folks can kind of understand what impacts might be there to contracting and use of transmission and those sorts of things, and make sure we're all on the same page when we are down in the weeds of talking about the buckets.
Okay, all right. And then Kathleen, you have your hand back up.
Great, yeah, thanks. It's Kathleen from Vistra. I think I wanted to kind of flag, I think going through the buckets is interesting. I might be a few steps behind. And so appreciate everyone's indulgence, but I'm still at the question of what's the counterfactual for an extended day ahead market to quote unquote imbalanced markets, and what is that analogy? So like I guess my current thinking, which I've got to go back to the OAT orders, is that all those entities, all the EM entities going into data, kind of like this is similar to what Dan was breaking down, but like is coming into a day ahead with certain resources that are under their existing transmission commitment. And that's got their own type of transmission. But there's under the OAT rules, you can go out and if there's economy energy available that is, better for your ratepayers, then you can go and transact that. And I believe it can, quote unquote displace, or you can use that instead of your, the portion that you had backed off of your ETCs. And I suppose that's the best analogy to what would happen in this extended day ahead market. But I really would hope we could talk about that. So I think that's what I'm throwing on the table is kind of taking a step back. What is the products that the EDAM is approximating? And so that we can kind of tie it to, okay, what OAT rules might be a good analogy or the equivalent to that would help me be able to think through then the buckets after that. I'm kind of thinking that we should think of the EDAM instructions as economy energy equivalent, and maybe that is consistent with secondary network service sort of treatment, but it's definitely not the most, this isn't, it's something I know a little bit, but only to be dangerous, and so completely open to experts that have much more experience than I on this, but that's the big question I have, and would like to hopefully we'll spend some time on that in this workshop before we get into the details on the bucket.
At this point in time, I think what you're asking for is, in essence, a discussion about what an OAT is and how an OAT works.
No, not necessarily, Deb. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's not what I'm asking for. What I'm saying is that I believe that there is, so like in my current thinking, EDAM instructions would be equivalent to economy energy that an LSE would procure. I would like to make sure that that is a consensus opinion, that that is the equivalent that we are discussing. And then I know from an OAT perspective, I know what the rules are that applies to that because we can look them up and there's precedent on it. So I'm not asking for what is OAT. I'm asking us to discuss conceptually, what is EDAM doing, right? Today, these an LLC would go out and procure economy energy. So that's what we're saying EDAM is replacing. I think that's kind of my first threshold question that I think we need to cover. If that makes sense.
Okay. Milos, would you like to jump in on that?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. This is Milos with the ISO. So, Kathleen, just maybe to answer your question, I think one of the things that the principles cover as well is the type of transmission that is made available. I think that in itself indicates the level of confidence in the transfers. I think the principles here consider firm, conditional firm, and this otherwise highly reliable type of transmission that I think we'll need to define through the working groups and depending on the type of transmission, I think that indicates a certain type of confidence that's different than just economy energy under the oath. It doesn't imply secondary or non-firm transmission. But there's another principle that I think largely is going to be addressed in the resource sufficiency group, but I think it has ties to this one is another principle is that EDAM transfer, there needs to be confidence in these EDAM transfers. I think treating EDAM transfers that it's economy energy or secondary, affording it that priority under the oath, which is effectively non-firm transmission type of priority. I don't think that that's necessarily consistent with that concept of high level of confidence in EDAM transfer. So I think as we get into these different buckets and defining the type of transmission that's made available under each and the firmness of it, I think we'll need to tease out that question. And I think the starting point here that the principles lay out is that there needs to be high level of confidence in these EDAM transfers, and that's why on the transmission front, the transmission at least that's being considered is firm transmission or conditional firm, which is the last type of transmission that gets curtailed. But I think there will be room as we get into the definition of the buckets, the type of transmission that's made available, to have that discussion that I think you're laying out. What type of transmission is supporting the EDAM transfers, and should EDAM transfers have a lower confidence than maybe other types of transactions?
Milos, I think I'm asking a simpler question. So let me try to rephrase it, and if this doesn't help, I can take a step back and let's talk offline. I'm asking a very principled, basic question about what kind of transactions would it be appropriate to allow access to zero-cost transmission in the context of an extended day-ahead market, which is effectively a joint dispatch agreement. I'm very familiar with the precedents for JDAs in a real-time basis. I think there's a lot of complexity in a day-ahead timeframe. So the question I'm asking is not transmission-related yet. It's assuming that what we're getting towards is making zero-cost transmission under a JDA available to multiple BAA areas for central dispatch. And so under that, I'm asking what transactions are appropriate. I think we have to start with what is it doing, what type of transactions are we talking about before we can kind of work through, well, that transaction should be in this, and I think it's not just the transmission type, it's the type of what are we going to consider the transactions out of EDAM as.
Well,
I was hoping we could have that as a scope item.
There are no zero-cost transmission transactions.
Technically, that's what so the energy imbalance market, what is happening in the energy imbalance market in the FERC, so when you file it at FERC, what you're asking for is a joint dispatch across an area with zero-cost transmission treatment. So that's FERC kind of language, so I apologize if I'm using FERC language and not CAISO language, but that's the concept of an energy imbalance market.
And this is not an energy imbalance market. This is an extended day-ahead market, and in the extended day-ahead market, you have bucket one, which is transmission that has already been contracted for resources and loads for serving that load. The second bucket is, in essence, transmission that a customer has purchased but is not necessarily using, and has the opportunity to go ahead and make it available in the extended day-ahead market as firm transmission or conditionally firm for transfers between EDAMs. And then the third bucket is, in essence, where the transmission provider has excess transmission that they haven't sold to anyone else that they can put into EDAM for firm, conditional firm, or highly reliable point-to-point transmission to allow transactions to take place. So in all instances, it's being paid for. The question in 2 and 3 is, how is it being paid for? But it's all based on the initial oath that the transmission provider has.
And okay, thank you, Deb. And so I had assumed at least one of these buckets would be treated similarly to an EIM transfer, a voluntary incremental imbalance. If that assumption, that would be really helpful to clarify if that's not any of these buckets.
I turn to Cathy or Milos on that, but my understanding is they all cost.
Yeah, Kathleen, I think I understand what you're getting at, because from a load serving entity, right? I have gone and I've procured all this transmission. I've had to designate it under the OAT, and if I elect to use a different resource for economy purchases, it may not qualify under the same transmission. I think that there's some definite work that we're going to have to do, and we're going to have to lay some groundwork, quite honestly, at FERC to be allowing non-designated resources to be using some of this transmission in this bucket 1 especially. So I think there's definite more conversation to be had on this. Happy to have more with you and think through some of this. These are just some of the technicalities. And I'm not sure if Dave Rubin from NVE is on here. He's my favorite FERC person, knowledgeable FERC person. But I think these are just some of the details that we as transmission service providers are going to have to make sure is clear in our OAT, so that all these various different resources that are not directly designated for our load can now be utilizing the same transmission that we did have designated resources on. I think that might be what
thanks, Cathy.
Getting at.
That is exactly what I'm getting at. And when I've done some legwork myself on this concept with, other regulators, I think this is going to be the biggest challenge, is how do they think about how this can operate in a day-ahead basis, since there's not a strong precedent for it. And for this to be successful, I think we need to lay that and really build a strong explanation. But I do see it as very coordinated to this conversation. If it's not, maybe it's another working group. But I'm happy to work with you offline. It's something, that we believe in EDAM, here to help, just really flagging that this is one of the biggest risks that I see.
Yeah, Dave Rubin and I have had conversations about, and others have had lots of conversations about the things that we're going to have to be talking about at FERC regarding this transmission, because it is out of the box, right? It's not precedented. It's not necessarily identical to other areas, and it is unique in the fact we all have our own OATs, right? And we all have all these rules. So it's definitely one that we'll have to make sure is outlined so that FERC understands what it is, and that we understand it as well.
Yeah. Right. And I think we'll get once we get to the scope list.
Yeah, is that Dave?
It is. I guess I really enjoyed that dialogue. And the one part I would add to it, though, is we can't just look at this from the OAT perspective, without recognizing the FERC precedent on RTOs as well, which is a load pays flow-based regime to get sort of the maximum efficiency out of the transmission system. And we're not doing an RTO, we're doing something as a much more incremental step. And as you indicated, Kathy, we also have to keep the OAT up for the parts of the West that wouldn't be in the market. But we are trying to move closer to that FERC-approved, long-standing, recognized RTO flow-based model. And so that's what you're seeing here, and I think you articulated really well, which is we're going beyond the standard treatment of DNRs. We're going a little bit beyond the use of secondary network, because again, we're moving other people's resources both on our own network transmission reservations, plus access to, making sales from it, which we typically couldn't do. But what you're really seeing with the buckets here was an attempt by the group to really look at what transmission is out there, the totality of it, and how best we could bring it to the EDAM market to really, achieve the most beneficial optimization with the most transmission that we could bring to it. And you're right, we're going to, it's a one of a kind. It's not something that we have stood up with FERC. It's got pieces of what's been out there, but I don't think it's not pure ODE and it's not pure RTO. So that's where we are in the middle.
Thanks, Cathy and Deb. Really appreciate this dialogue. Looking forward to working on this fun, challenging problem. And
all right, thanks, Kathleen. Jeff Spires, you've had your hand up for a while. Sorry.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're unmuted.
My name's Connie and I'm from Nevada and worked on transmission issues myself. And I want to just weigh in with Kathleen. Without some expansion or changing the rules, there simply is no excess transmission to be utilized from network transmission service because it is tied to the resource, and you can undesignate it and then use it for something else, but the amount is never larger than the load. And as for excess transmission external to a balancing authority to bring in resources, excess network resource or economy energy, the point external to control area, that's generally done with WSGP agreements, and there is no identifiable transmission that is fungible to utilize in that effect, for this purpose. And it seems to me we've already set aside for the energy imbalance market, which already existed as a transmission ancillary service, as available transmission. So it seems like my thought is that that you're counting that transmission twice. You're counting on utilizing it twice. I see that Dave was trying to chat with me while I was talking, and I apologize, David, I can't do two things at the same time. But we can talk about this offline, but I share Kathleen's concerns with respect to bucket 1 and bucket 2 about what kinds of firm transmission would be available in EDAM.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Connie. Jeff, you had your hand raised?
I did. Thanks, Deb. Good morning. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. I just wanted to make a couple of comments after listening to the last few discussions. I think Kathleen, as well as before that, Doug and Dan were raising some really important questions. And I think I sort of boiled down those conversations to the question of what is the overall vision for EDAM. There's some, I think, fundamental questions around, is it voluntary? And if so, to what extent? And how does that translate to generation, to load, to transmission? What are the assumptions about that? And I think Dan raised some pretty important questions too, basically driving at, do other markets continue to exist? Like in the EIM, where we see that we have the EIM and the bilateral markets effectively coexisting, is that the vision here? And lastly, what kinds of transactions do we expect to occur through the EDAM? Are they economic displacement? Are they something different from that? These are sort of fundamental questions, and there were some of the discussion at yesterday's workshop was similar. And I think these are high-level issues that need to be sort of commonly understood amongst stakeholders because they do impact every working group. And I guess my fundamental comment is I really encourage the CAISO to think about what venue is there to have a higher level discussion. about what EDAM is, what the principles are. And I think that part of that discussion needs to be revisiting and refining the principles that have been put together so far, because those were developed last summer with some entities, but they weren't developed with, sorry, there's some echo coming through. If someone could mute themselves, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah.
Anyway, the principles that were developed are helpful for initiating the discussion here, but they were developed with a smaller group. They don't necessarily reflect the consensus of the broader stakeholders, and I think it would be a mistake to just assume that they do and dive straight into the details of the working group. So, I guess just fundamentally, I think we need to find the right forum and the right opportunity to take some of these higher level discussions about principles, about key assumptions about what the design looks like, and have that discussion and try to get to a place where we have a set of agreed upon principles and concepts that is broadly understood and then helps inform these working groups. Because I do think it's challenging when a variety of stakeholders have a somewhat different vision of what EDAM should look like. So I just wanted to make that comment and again suggest that the CAISO consider how to do that, because I do think it's really important.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate the comment. Carrie Bentley, and then I'd like to move on.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I'll just be really brief. Completely support what Jeff said, and in fact sent a note around through the website yesterday using that exact same language, even though Jeff and I didn't even talk about the fundamental design. And my recommendation is in that sheet that in the supply group we did for working group 1, adding a fundamental design column, and then have core design paths, because as Jeff noted, there's going to be different designs based on the decisions you make about the fundamental design. And I think some sort of spreadsheet that tracks your fundamental design options and then what happens to the different core design paths will be incredibly important just to keep it cohesive. So, thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carrie. Okay, so I think we've talked enough about the buckets at this point. Why don't we move on to slide 11 and go on to the congestion rent allocation, which is another item that this group needs to take up, is to how the objective in essence is how do we hold the customers harmless without creating new uplifts. With respect to the congestion rents, the transfers would be between the EDAM entities and between the EDAM entity and the CAISO. The CAISO will be continuing to use its existing congestion rent allocation, but the EDAM entities that are currently EIM entities, the question becomes is how should that allocation be done between the BAs? Is it split 50-50? Is it split, 100% to the balancing authority area where the congestion is? How does all that work? Next slide, Christine. And then with respect to the EIM BAAs, oh, hold on, this is the CAISO. Next slide. And then the EIM EDAM entities, how are they going to go ahead and distribute that to the load serving entities and the transmission customers? That would be treatment as part of the OAT, and each EDAM entity would have to go ahead and sub-allocate that appropriately within their OAT, and that will end up being part of the discussion. So with that slide, next slide, please. So what I'd really like to get to is the list of scope items that we put out previously, and for the presentation for today, I augmented it with all of the answers based on the December stakeholder meeting that took place. So if we could go ahead and pull that up,
Sure.
Emily.
Yeah, Michelle, can you give Emily presenting rights, please? I think you're good to go, Emily. Great.
All right.
And to, just so you all know, there's a little nav bar to the left of the screen, so you can size the document on your own if you have trouble seeing it.
So we had previously, oh, the red line didn't show up. Interesting. Can you enable content, Emily? Oops. Cute picture. Okay.
I like that picture.
So the red line didn't, go to review. Oh, put on all markup. There we go. That's what the problem is. There we go. Okay, there's the red line. I was going to say, doggone it, I worked on this thing. So what I did is I went ahead and I put in additional detail based on the responses to questions that had already come out. So, Carrie, I'm not sure how, you wanted to add another column that had to do with core path design. How does that vary from the issue column?
Yeah, so I think issue would be transmission. Oh, sorry, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. So the issue is transmission availability, but I would think before that, a fundamental design question is what transmission even has to be turned over? What are the, base participation rules? Because that will then determine what is the purpose of the different types of transmission. And so depending on the participation rules, you may have different paths when you start talking about the external market design questions.
So the principles stated, and please correct me, Cathy, if I'm wrong, the only transmission that had to be turned over to EDAM was the transmission associated with resource efficiency. That's it. The additional transmission that either the transmission customer or transmission provider has is offered on a voluntary basis. Did I get that right? Kathy?
Yeah. So anything that was kind of in bucket one, unless it had to be self-scheduled for some reason, then it would be available to the market for optimization. Bucket two, there was some discussion, I think, in the principles docket. Milos can clarify this, as to whether or not it would be possible if somebody didn't voluntarily put it in there for the market to use it. But there's a lot of questions and issues around that one. And then bucket three, again, that's going to take a change to a transmission provider's oath. And that, that would be a determination of that transmission service provider whether they want to do that or not. My preference would be that they would, but I don't get to rule over all transmission service providers.
Right.
Yeah, so Deb, I think my point maybe is broader too. It's that we haven't defined what resource efficiency means yet. So what amounts are you saying each entity needs on a daily basis, on a 45-day basis for resource efficiency? Like, are you talking about the 45-day check, a day ahead check, a day of check? And those rules, I think, will then fall naturally into what you need in each bucket. Kind of gets to what Dan was saying too.
Well, so resource efficiency is being discussed in parallel with this. So
yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's why I think we need another column to track the interrelationship between the working groups. Because what if resource efficiency in that group gets defined in a way that then impacts what transmission availability means?
But transmission, all of resource efficiency is in bucket one. So everything in bucket 1 would cover what's required by resource efficiency. Now, what transmission requirements might change over the evolution of the working groups, but bucket 1 is set up to cover whatever is required by resource efficiency. And we have the question underneath column 2, what types of transmission must be included in the types of transmission made available under each, and we should have bucket in there, but under each bucket is the intent.
Yeah, I see that. I just think, so sure, for number 2, I see you have the question, but I think that question will directly track back to some fundamental design decisions that still need to be made. I think a lot of these will. So my suggestion was just to track those somewhere, so we all have a common understanding, because it sounds like some of the EIM entities perhaps have a common understanding, but maybe some of us that weren't involved in those conversations don't.
Sure, we can track that. And then add it back to the items that's necessary, when they're needed.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it'll be an onerous process. I just think it'll be an iterative one.
Yes. As the groups evolve and get more into the detail. So for the first actually grouping of items, let's see if I can make this bigger on my screen. Oh.
You see the nav bar on the left, Deb?
Oh, I see what it does. Okay. All right. So the first, let's see, what did I end up doing here? So the first 3 items are in essence grouping of transmission availability. So the first set of questions, what are the purposes and definitions of the different buckets? What types of transmission is going to be included in each one of the buckets? And what transmission issues overlap or require coordination with resource efficiency decisions? And then the next grouping of transmission availability is how would unused reservation transmission automatically be made available to EDAM, or is it on a voluntary basis, which we already talked about? And what existing uses of transmission might preclude them from being used in the EDAM market? And then how will CAISO consider utilization of transmission internal to the EDAM entity network? So those are the 3 scoping areas for transmission availability. Does anyone else have any other scoping items that they've thought of to add to this section? I see, yeah. Vijay, you're
Thank you.
ready?
This is Vijay with WRA. This seems to be a bit of a red herring to me, and I'm not deep into this as many of you on this call. But as Jeff has brought up, and it came up 2 years ago in the EDAM workshop in Folsom also, I could use clarity from this group of all the brainy, smarter people on if EDAM is voluntary market, then that question up there in the first category, should that be what types of transmission can be included if it's voluntary? If you put must, then the voluntary logic goes out of the window. So let's just face it, if EDAM is meant to use available unused transmission under whatever category, bucket 1, 2, or 3, then I think these questions should be clarified and sorted out. If you're going to have this scenario that it is voluntary, to me it seems voluntary. You're not forcing participants to enter the EDAM. It's available transmission that they would like to play out, whether they are point-to-point or network or unused, bucket 3, whatever. So I urge some clarification on the can and must. Thank you. And maybe I'm confusing things more. and I don't mean to. Thank you.
It's all right. So the intent of the can and must, you must provide transmission for all of the load that is that you're serving. So you must provide transmission from the resources that are serving your load as part of, if you're in EDAM, okay? If you have excess transmission that you want to sell, whether you're a customer and you've got a long-term permanent contract and you can resell it, or you're a transmission provider and you've got excess transmission, that's the can piece.
Perfect, thank you. That helps me a lot. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Caitlin.
Hi, Caitlin Leo, Terrace Energy Strategies. I just wanted to suggest that on the internal transmission availability question, I think you've moved that down to the third one here now, that we also add for consideration any internal EDAM requirements for third-party load or generation to participate in the market. It's been something that's come up a lot in the EIM, and I think it will be important to consider as we develop these rules for EDAM as well.
So the requirement at the moment is the EIM entity. In essence, you have to be an EIM entity to join EDAM. So if you're an internal load within an EIM entity, then you're in EDAM. If you're a load that is not an EIM entity, then you cannot be in EDAM. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I'm talking about any additional transmission provision requirements that an EDAM entity might place on a third-party load or generation in order to participate in the market. I recognize that we've kind of asked this question before about ensuring consistency, and I know there's been some pushback from the EIM entities on having consistent requirements, but I think we at least need to consider what types of requirements would be acceptable under that internal transmission availability category.
Okay. Emily, could you add into the third block, the scope after network? Yep, right there, carriage return. So Caitlin, how best would you want to word that?
I would just say, let's see, maybe consider transmission requirements for third-party generators and load within EDAM footprints.
Resources and load?
Yes.
Yeah. It's okay. Load and resources is fine. It doesn't matter which one goes first. There you go. Does that work?
Looks good.
All right. Excellent. Carrie.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Going back to 2 callers ago, the definition of voluntary, that would be one of the fundamental designs that I just thought we should articulate. That way those questions don't keep popping up, right? What does it mean to be voluntary? Directly impacts the may or the must for the different buckets. So that's just an example of what I was talking about that might make it a little bit more concrete. A very separate question. Your response to Caitlin was that you have to be an EIM to participate in EDAM. And I was wondering whether within this initiative somewhere you're going to consider opening up participation for both EDAM and EIM to non-load BAAs or supply BAAs.
That would go on the second listing. So let me just make a note.
Thanks, Deb.
I don't know how that would, to be frank with you, I don't know how that would work. If you're not an EIM entity, we don't have your models, we don't have you in our system. And if we don't have you in EIM, then I don't know how we would put you into EDAM. And
Well, I
you
was
need
more,
to be,
yeah, I was more thinking you'd expand the rules for EIM as well. So you would allow, you know, BAAs that are transmission only to participate in both.
a BAA that's transmission only?
Sure, like, you know, the New Mexico ones, right, that are being created. I guess you can call them supply BAAs, where they don't have load, but they just have supply and transmission.
Oh, you mean a gen-only BAA?
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, we do have a gen-only BAA that is pursuing becoming an EIM entity. So that would, they would come in as an EIM entity and then be available for EDAM.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. Hold on, I got too many things open at the moment. And if you've already spoken, if you could go ahead and lower your hand, that would be great. Tom Wu? Tom, are you there? Are you on mute?
Yeah, I was on mute. Sorry, I double muted. This is Tom Wu from WAPA. For bucket one, I can see two kinds of transmission. One kind probably is the California ISO, where the PTOs have turned over all of their transmission. So there's no issue. There's some those entities, they may have some point-to-point or multi-point to multi-point transmission contracts to serve their load. And those contracts are based on contract path concept, not based on power flow. So even if they turn over their point-to-point contract or multi-point to multi-point contract, that doesn't mean that you can actually serve their load using the flow-based congestion management model. So there might be a discrepancy there. So I don't know, which item on the list this belongs to.
Okay. Well, I'll add it as a note and then we'll figure out where it goes.
Okay.
Okay. Kathleen again.
Thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I'd like to request another fundamental question and then another one related to this. But on the fundamental question, can we add a discussion on if the EDAM is addressing incremental dispatches or not to the fundamental questions? And it's very relevant to me to the transmission, how we treat it, because so if we could add that to one of the questions that we need to address, that would be very helpful. Similar to VJ's voluntary, I think they're all bundled together. I did want to discuss directly and kind of touch on what Caitlin brought up about the other types of resources as well as Terry. While there may be gen-only VAs, I know that we recently did that sub-entity effort, and one of the challenges that I found with the sub-entity definition is it restricted who could qualify for sub-entity treatment to those who own wires. And there are places within the EIM footprint, states that are considering increasing the amount of competitive retail that is allowed to operate within those states for a durable design consistent with the idea of competitive retailers that don't own wires. I highly encourage us to think about allowing for that to have a sub-entity treatment and then including, and so that is the bigger picture question about sub-entity, but directly relevant to even regardless of who qualifies, I think we should be talking about if there is a sub-entity, how do these different scope items apply to sub-entity versus the EIM entity? Is there a difference? Does it not make any differentiation? I don't see sub-entities referred to in here. I think that would be helpful to add. Does that make sense, Deb?
Yeah, well, EDAM is premised on a balancing authority area. So if you're talking about a sub-entity, are you talking about a load, a separate load?
Yeah, so the CAISO recently, and I don't know if it's been implemented or not, but approved the EIM sub-entity rules of what qualifies and created this idea of a nested sub-entity. It also feeds into like the pricing that'll eventually. So if you are taking that framework from having an EIM entity area and then allowing sub-entities in the real time, I do believe that that would just translate to the day-ahead space. And so wanted to make sure you captured the sub-entity piece here, which I think will be critical for the EIM entities that was their, their big.
Okay.
All right. And on the competitive, I wanted to also just make sure I'm understanding. So what Kate, you added for Caitlin, if you could scroll down.
Emily, can you scroll? Yeah, there you go.
I think third-party resources also is referring to and I was just wondering if Caitlin could clarify if that's the same as, like, I'm talking about competitive retailers that have, so third-party load, I mean, competitive retailers that have load positions. Are you referring to that type of resource or that type of entity, or are you referring to a different type of entity? Could Caitlin clarify what she meant by third-party load?
Hey, Kathleen, it's Caitlin here with Energy Strategies. I think I'm thinking about it broader than just competitive retail sellers. There are also, third-party municipal type entities within balancing authority areas that I'm also thinking about within that context of third-party loads. So.
No, super helpful. Thank you. I'm making a note. Munis, ag, public power. Cool. For the third-party resources, I just wanted to throw some support behind that. I think that there's a deeper level of question as well when we're talking about the third-party generation that has longer-term transmission commitments, whether that's firm point-to-point or that's non-firm. There's non-firm that, let's say, is weekly that I would versus daily versus hourly. I think we need to get into the details on what type of transmission that the transmission backing the third party generation that they have on longer term arrangements, even if it's non-firm. We should talk about that in detail.
Yeah, I think we've already captured that up in the first block.
If it's captured in the first block, can we clarify what's different and what was added for, like, what Caitlin is referring to? For the one that just got added, I want to make sure I'm understanding the difference of the scope.
So, all right, so go back. Emily, can you back down to 3 for a second? Okay, so what I took from what Caitlin wanted to add was consider the transmission requirements for third-party resources and loads within an EDAM footprint. So within a balancing authority area, you might have a municipal utility, as an example. And so that's a resource and load that's within the EDAM. They're not their own balancing authority area. And what are the transmission requirements for them? Versus, Emily, go back up to 1. And 1, what we're trying to do, move the cursor away, from my insert, thank you. In the second sub-bullet underneath internal design questions and comments, We need to define the firmness of transmission available to EDAM, what type of transmission is made available, firm, conditional firm, highly reliable transmission. We can add in, I think that covers all the ones that you were in reference to, Kathleen.
So I think, could you make a note on this one to consider transmission commitments that are held by third-party resources?
Okay. Emily, in row 2, below decisions, can you add a new question? Okay, yeah. Consider transmission that is owned by third party.
Reserved is probably better. It's not, rather than owned, I mean just they have in reservations. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's really great.
No problem. That's what this is all about. Okay, Mr. Greenleaf. Wow, I haven't talked to you in a long time. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm doing great, Deb. I'm glad you were well. Real quick question. It's, I guess, a process question again. And for context, I raised the same one yesterday. And it ties into, the change, actually everything you've been talking about with Caitlin, Carrie, and Kathleen, just on with respect to sub-entities, for lack of a better term, in non-CAISO EIM entity areas, as far as, kind of trickle down obligations, requirements, and rights or whatever. I thought I understood in yesterday's working group, the CAISO said, well, that's really going to be dealt with by those EIM entity in the context of changes to their own OAT, and do kind of parallel and separate processes as opposed to this. I'd like to see it, I think, in the context of this effort, but I'm just kind of trying to get clarity on the home for these issues. I mean, I like the change you've made with respect, what Caitlin added, and would advocate that those issues be addressed here. But I thought I understood from yesterday's discussion, working group 1, they were going to basically say, hey, those kind of things that result in changes to non-CAISO EIM entity OATs would be dealt with by them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So that obviously, so can't change Idaho Power's OAT. Idaho Power has to change their OAT. But I believe the intent is that the discussion here would be is how are the OATs going to change in order to implement EDAM. So from a transmission perspective, the transmission all has to be consistent across all of the EDAM customers or EDAM entities, I should say. So I think it's a different answer for resource sufficiency than it is for transmission availability.
Okay, all right. Okay, so you see that as distinguishable. I mean, it would be nice if all the issues were kind of vetted centrally, but, I understand, I guess, on specific issues, there may be a reason to delineate that, but okay. Anyway, at least with respect to transmission issues, the intent is for them to be vetted here.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Great.
No problem. Caitlin and Kathleen, do you have additional questions, or do you just forget to lower your hand? Okay, great. All right. So for transmission availability, does anybody else have any other thoughts as far as scope items that need to be added? Okay, moving on to the next item is timing and duration. We've already had a few discussions about that. I did add in some of the additional responses that were provided in the questions or the responses to the questions for timing and duration. Does anybody have anything else to add for that? Okay. Transmission unavailability. Obviously, we all have issues after the day-ahead market closes. Transmission line can go down, resources go down, forced out, and redispatch needs to happen. So I think we need to go ahead and tackle as part of this group what the consequences are of changes after EDAM if the resource or the transmission is not available in real time. So Tong, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I have a question. My understanding from yesterday's meeting was that the goal of EDAM is try to meet the load forecast in a day-ahead market. Basically, the outcome is all the base schedules or the supply resources that would meet the load forecast. If that's the case, that occurs between 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. During that time frame, I'm not sure the ISO would consider any transmission outage. According to current ISO's operating procedure, after 9 a.m., if there is any unplanned outage, transmission outage, the ISO would not even consider that in the current day-ahead market. So from that perspective, I don't know why transmission unavailability or outage would even affect the EDAM, because this is not real time. Everything is on paper. We're just trying to, line up resource to meet load based on whatever transmission was available at 9 a.m. So this might be applicable to EIM and real time. I don't know why this item is here, transmission unavailability, as far as day ahead is concerned.
I think what the intent of having this item here is to make sure that everybody understood what the impact was. Once we have, you're correct, if the transmission is not out at when the day ahead market closes at 10, then it's assumed in. But then what happens between the day ahead and real time, and what are the financial implications to that entity who loses a resource or the transmission is unavailable that they had planned on using?
I see, so but that would be a real-time issue then. At that time, it's beyond the day-ahead market. It will be in EIM to address that.
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Stephen Pruitt? Oops. Okay. All right, and then the last item.
Hi, no, Steve Pruitt, LA. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. It was, okay, you guys had that.
Yeah.
You hear me now?
Double muted, and it gets very frustrating.
Yes. So would this be the right box to include, or at least bring up the question, what if the transmission is unawarded in EDAM? Is it given back?
Yes.
Is it released back? Okay.
Yes.
So this is only for transmission that is awarded in the optimization solution.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, then the next item is compensation. And this will get very much into detail. And if you can just slide it up a little bit, maybe we can fit all on one page. Yeah. compensation and congestion rents. Maybe not. Maybe change view to I think it's read mode or web layout. There we go. Okay. So how should transmission made available to EDAM be compensated? And then the second, which is one of the discussions we had earlier, is congestion rent allocation, which is going to be a big topic. Does anybody have any other scope items to add for either congestion rent or the compensation question? Tom, is your hand up again?
Yeah, my hand is up again about the compensation. Okay. My question probably is more related to bucket 3. I don't quite understand all the details of bucket 3. So I was thinking that transmission owner will get paid according to their rate, and then this will be allocated to somebody. So how would that mechanism work? Who would pay for that?
Well,
maybe
I think
that's the level of details in this discussion.
Yeah, that's what we'll get into when we get to the detailed discussion. At this point, I'd just like to make sure that we've got all the scope items that people have.
Would you consider a mechanism where transmission owner can bid their transmission into the market, so ISO can do a co-optimization of energy and transmission capacity, where the cost would be allocated to people in their LNP. So you don't need explicit allocation, so it's going to be part of the price. But there's a lot of details that need to be discussed that may or may not work. You have to deal with a double payment. You know, what if somebody is already paying the rate now, they accidentally pay addition because it's embedded in LNP? But I don't know whether there's something you would want to discuss.
I think that's what, Emily, if you could move your arrow down to, no. Keep your page where you're at. Underneath compensation in the third column, two lines up from the bottom where it says other. In the context of bucket 3 transmission, what is the compensation structure for bucket 3? OAT-based hurdle rate or other? I think that's where we were trying to have that discussion once we get there.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right. And then the last area for this group is, in essence, moving down, is the external resources. So what about the entities that are not participating in EDAM? How do intertie bids or external resources participate, not participate? How is all that included? What ends up happening to the types of scheduling points that we currently have for RBA? What are the scheduling points for EDAM BAs? How does the border change, I guess, is what the big question is here. And how do people that are not participating have the ability to participate or not in EDAM? So are there any other thoughts on that as far as scope is concerned? Okay. All right. Are there items that we missed? additional items that this group should be tackling? Okay, so we had transmission availability, which is going to be the transmission types, buckets, the firmness, point-to-point network, time and duration for availability, impact of what happens, just so everybody knows about compensation-wise, what happens if the transmission is not available in real time. It does go to the EIM. But what's the impact to the day-ahead market? Today in CAISO's market, you get settled at the day-ahead market, and then you have to resettle for the additional transmission in the real-time market. We talked about compensation and then congestion rents. So I see 2 hands went up. Bree, Alan? Or Bri? Are you muted?
Bri, your line is unmuted. Go ahead and hit unmute either on your phone or on the WebEx screen.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry about that. My computer literally froze as I was trying to unmute myself. So this is Bree Allen with Bonneville Power, and one thing that was an issue of conversation for us in the first iteration of EDAM was talking about congestion management, in particular because Bonneville system manages congestion to flow gates, and at least in the initial proposal, the EDAM was not intending to manage congestion to flow gates. So just maybe a little placeholder to have some further conversations on how congestion management of the transmission flows might work.
Okay, certainly.
Thank you.
Okay, Katie. Callie, sorry.
Hi, that's okay. This is Callie Wells with WPTF. So I just had a question back on the congestion rent allocation. And I'm not sure if this is something that needs to be explicitly listed in the scope items or if you can confirm that this will be addressed at some point. But I think way back at kind of one of the last in-person stakeholder meetings on this, there was discussion about whether or not there's a consistent framework of congestion rent allocation between the BAAs. So for example, I think the discussion was whether or not every BA would be required to have some sort of quote unquote CRR allocation mechanism, or if BAAs can opt in or opt out of having some sort of framework. So I think at some point we need to talk about whether or not all the BAs would need to have at least some sort of consistent framework, or it's up to each BAA individually.
Okay. And I think that was in there. Yep. Okay. All right. Great. Jeff.
Hi, it's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I just wanted to raise a question about the last bullet on this slide. It caught my eye, and it might just be the way that it's worded. But one of the key topics that we think we need to discuss is the congestion rent allocation between EDAM BAs and the CAISO interties, particularly on multi-segment paths like the Pacific AC and Pacific DC, where there are multiple rights holders on two different segments that are required to facilitate that transfer. And I'm not sure whether this bullet is referring to that, but it seems to be more of a statement than a scope item. And, you know, as I mentioned before, around trying to find consensus on the principles, this is one area that we believe that the principles as they're currently stated are not workable and need to be revisited with further discussion. So I just wanted to ensure that, or basically ask what the meaning of that last statement is, because it just seems a little bit unclear to me.
Yeah, so the meaning of that last statement is, in essence, the CAISO already has a congestion allocation within our balancing authority area, and we have rights that we've already given for 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, 1 year within our balancing authority area. And all we're saying is that for our grid, that allocation is going to remain the same. But within the allocation between the EDAMs, and we count the CAISO as an EDAM entity. So the allocation between the EDAMs is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about the congestion compensation and how that works between the EDAMs.
I appreciate that clarification. That's really helpful. One suggestion is I think that second to last bullet should actually explicitly say including the CAISO, because A, it's an important issue, but also B, because those original principles did specifically call out transfers with the CAISO and propose something different from the more general paradigm for EDAM to EDAM transfers. And so I think it's a little bit confusing, and it would be worthwhile just to clarify that discussion point includes both.
Okay. We'll go ahead and make that addition to the scoping item list.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else have any other items that we might have missed? Okay, we have about 15 minutes left. Do we want to start talking a little bit more about defining the buckets and the purpose of the buckets? Or do we want to hold off for that discussion for Thursday? General thoughts? Okay. I ask this question. Do we want to go ahead and keep the order the way that we currently have it in the scoping document, which is what's up here? So we've got transmission availability first, timing and duration second, unavailability would be third, and then go into compensation, and then congestion rents, and external resource participation. And then we'd need to weave in the additional items that I've got notes on. But does that sound like a good order to start discuss the discussion items? Okay, I'm gonna assume silence is consensus if I don't hear anything.
You did receive feedback. Leanne Torkelson said the order is fine, so there was some feedback from participants.
Oh, thank you. I have too many windows open trying to make sure I see everybody's hands. Okay, then why don't we go on to the next slide? So we went through. Oh, somebody's open.
Mute yourself.
Could everybody please mute themselves? Thank you. Okay, so we went through a background of the principles, had a discussion about that. We were able to go through the whole scope of items. Thank you, guys. I was kind of betting we weren't going to get through all the scope items, so I really appreciate everybody's help there. We have a number of clarifications that we'll go ahead and add into scope items, and the additional items that were brought up in the discussion What the intent is that we're going to go ahead and have put out notes once a week based on what the discussion items were, and then we'll go ahead and be able to, everybody will have the same notes that the CAISO's got on a weekly basis. So we'll do that after Thursday's meeting, posting that Thursday night, hopefully, hopefully before midnight. We've got all the notes in there, and then working from that document. If anyone wants to give a presentation on how to define the buckets, availability, compensation, how congestion rents should be done, any of those types of things, as Christine said earlier, if you could go ahead and just drop us a note using the link and let us know what presentation you'd like to give and when you'd like to give it, so that we can go ahead and sequence that into the schedule. But at this point, I think the Thursday's discussion will be kicking off the purpose and the definition of the buckets, and then the transmission issues overlapping with resource efficiency, sorry. So we'll need to coordinate that. And then we can go from there. But I think getting into what each one of the buckets is going to do, how the transmission is used, the firmness of the transmission, what ends up happening in the optimization, as Tong brought up. There is discussion of putting the cost of transmission in with the energy cost and the impacts of that. So I think we've got a full plate for Thursday. Does anybody have any other thoughts before I actually give you 12 minutes back? Okay, if anybody has any thoughts, if you want to reach out to me directly, as I'm sure most of you know, we do have a spot to put questions in. So go ahead and fill out the questions and we'll get back to you with the answers as soon as possible. And I look forward to facilitating this item and coming up with a design for the transmission and congestion rents and congestion allocation. So thank you everyone for your participation this morning. Greatly appreciate it. And we'll talk to everybody at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.